Thanks, Jason. I'm just going to come on camera for just a minute, introduce myself. I am Adonica McAllister, and I am the Juvenile Justice Lead Planner. Tony, are you there?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tony Lockley. I'm the CJA coordinator at the Governor's Crime Commission.
And we are going to be presenting about our JJ planning team and the priorities for the upcoming year. So we work alongside our Juvenile Justice Planning Committee of the Governor's Crime Commission. And our mission is to provide resources for youth who are at risk of becoming delinquent, or youth who are already delinquent or involved in the juvenile court system, from intake through aftercare. The Juvenile Justice Planning Committee has two subcommittees, the first being our Racial and Ethnic Disparities Subcommittee, who develops strategies to reduce minority overrepresentation in the juvenile justice system. And then we have our Children's Justice Act Task Force, who supports the improvement and strengthening of the front end intake and investigative piece of the child abuse and neglect child welfare system. We administer grants through two federal funding sources, the first being Title II, or our Juvenile Justice Funds, and that is through the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention of the Office of Justice Programs. And then we administer the state's Children's Justice Act allocation, and that is through the Children's Bureau of the Administration for Children and Families, and that's through the Department of Health and Human Services.
So all of our funded programs are required to submit performance reports, and here's why data is essential. The information you provide plays an important role at both the state and national levels, and it helps to guide future funding decisions and improve program outcomes. And as you can see here, this is how it works. Grantees report to the Governor's Crime Commission, and they share essential insights into their projects and progress. The GCC then compiles and reports this data to our federal partners, including the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And finally, our federal partners aggregate this information to present nationwide data to Congress and the Office of Management and Budget. And this creates a comprehensive picture of juvenile justice outcomes across the country. Your contributions are significant, and they also help to shape national understanding and guide future decisions in juvenile justice policies and funding. And again, all projects are funded by the GCC, must submit annual progress reports that track specific goals and objectives. These reports are vital for demonstrating both your progress and ours, as they enable us to report back to our federal partners, as I just mentioned. Both Children's Justice Act and Juvenile Justice reports must submit a mid-year review and final report. And just a quick reminder, submitting these reports on time is extremely important. And if reports aren't submitted as scheduled, it can impact your ability to receive reimbursements for project-related expenses.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Title II Formula Grant. And again, these are our juvenile justice grants. You'll note that these subawards have a period of performance from January to December. We are on a calendar year. And so these grants will begin January 1st, 2026 through December 31st, 2027. So the purpose of the Title II Formula Grant Program is to support states in implementing education, training, research, prevention, diversion, treatment, and rehabilitation programs in the area of juvenile justice and juvenile delinquency, as well as to support juvenile justice system improvement efforts. And again, here's a little bit about our Racial and Ethnic Disparities Subcommittee. It's important to note that the reduction of racial and ethnic disparities is a priority not only of the Governor's Crime Commission, but also of our federal partners and of the state, including our state's juvenile justice system. The purpose of the RED subcommittee is to develop strategies to reduce minority overrepresentation in the juvenile justice system. And this subcommittee works to support programs by developing contextualized language in the funding priority and reviewing program outputs. Before we get into the funding priorities, it's important to note that there are funding caps instituted for our juvenile justice applications. All of the juvenile justice funding priorities have a funding cap of $200,000, except for our discretionary priority, which has a funding cap of $100,000. It's really important that if you are a program that we've previously funded that may be requesting additional funding, that you illustrate that there's some growth that includes additional program activities or additional services provided. And requests for funding should always be reasonable and realistic. So our Title II juvenile justice funding priorities for the upcoming grant cycle include counseling, training, and mentoring programs, educational programs and services for at-risk youth, positive youth development programs, racial and ethnic disparities, and discretionary programs. And I'll go through each of these just very briefly, but all of these can be found in detail inside of our request for applications. So our counseling, training, and mentoring programs are programs that support academic tutoring, vocational and technical training, drug and violence prevention counseling, and other efforts that are designed to link at-risk juveniles with the appropriate services. And those services must be administered by programs and professionals that are properly screened and trained to work with youth. And again, this has a funding cap of $200,000. That's over a period of 2 years. Our next funding priority is educational programs and services for at-risk youth, which also has a funding cap of $200,000. Educational programs or supportive services for at-risk youth or delinquent youth are designed to encourage juveniles to remain in elementary and secondary schools and to provide services to assist juveniles in making the transition to the world of work and self-sufficiency. So a lot of what we'd be looking at, again, are vocational programs, training programs, and job resources that also encourage juveniles to continue their education in some capacity. Positive youth development programs also have a funding cap of $200,000, and these are programs that are designed to assist youth in obtaining a sense of safety and structure, belonging and membership, self-worth and social contribution, independence and control over one's life, and a sense of closeness in their interpersonal relationships. Our discretionary priority, which has a funding cap of $100,000, is designed to support comprehensive juvenile justice and delinquency prevention programs that meet the needs of youth through the collaboration of the many local systems before which a youth may appear. And this includes schools, law enforcement agencies, the courts, mental health agencies, child welfare agencies, and a whole host of other community resources. And finally, our Racial and Ethnic Disparities Program Priority, or RED, is designed to support programs, research, or other initiatives primarily to address the disproportionate number of youth members who come into contact with the juvenile justice system. And this aligns with one of our federal requirements, which we call our core requirements. Applications applying for funding under the RED program priority should make special care to describe the youth population that they intend to serve in terms of race and ethnicity, explain how their project aims to reduce disparities and or promote racial equity for youth in their communities, most notably for those who are at risk of juvenile justice system involvement or are already justice involved. And then finally, we ask that these programs and all of our programs describe the program's potential impact on youth outcomes, and especially by race and ethnicity. As Tony indicated earlier in our presentation, all of our funded programs are required to submit report data. And the report data may include demographic data about the participants, frequency and capacity of your programs, any program activities. It's also important to note that if you are receiving program participants that are referred from the juvenile justice system or to other resources inside of the juvenile justice system, as well as outputs and outcomes. The reason why this is so broad right now is because our committee is in the process of developing stronger language around what sort of deliverables we would like to see in terms of performance reporting. So that said, it's very important to keep in mind when you are completing your application for funding that you identify how you'll measure any potential outputs or outcomes of your program. In terms of other requirements for Title II funding, there is no match or cost sharing requirement for these grants. You don't have to submit a match waiver or anything in order to, not have to contribute a match. Only one application per priority may be submitted for funding under this funding source. And finally, it's very important to note that if your program seeks to transport youth, you have to get written prior approval from the Governor's Crime Commission. This is defined as a participant support cost. And so we also consult our federal program for written approval in order to accomplish this. And that's all that I have right now for Title II. So I'm going to pass it to Tony, and she will talk a little bit about the Children's Justice Act.
Thanks, Adonica. I'll be going over the CJA priorities, and these grants have a period of performance of 10/1/2025 to 9/30/2027. And a little bit about the Children's Justice Act Task Force function and purpose. It's to better protect children. Each state is required to form and sustain a multidisciplinary task force on children's justice. And this group should include professionals who have expertise in both the criminal justice system and the systems that deal with child abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, exploitation, and child maltreatment fatalities. These experts bring valuable experience to help ensure that these serious issues are addressed effectively, as outlined in Section 107C1. So for the Children's Justice Act funding requirements, grants under the CJA support programs aimed at improving the handling of child abuse and neglect cases, specifically focusing on assessing and investigating suspected child abuse and neglect to reduce trauma for the child and family, investigating suspected fatalities related to child abuse and neglect, prosecuting cases of child abuse and neglect, and that includes child sexual abuse and exploitation, and evaluating cases involving children with disabilities or serious health issues who may be victims of abuse or neglect. So it's also important to note that the Children's Justice Act cannot be used to fund direct services or primary prevention programs. What this means is that any request for funding aimed at providing direct therapy or counseling for individuals, as well as prevention programs designed to reduce first-time offenses, won't be eligible. However, there are other funding sources you can explore to support these types of initiatives, and some of the alternatives include Title II or Juvenile Justice, Victims of Crime Act, and Violence Against Women Act. And these programs may offer the support you need for direct services and prevention efforts. So the CJA funding priorities, when applying for grant funds, It's important to align your proposals with the recommendations that are set forth by the state task force. Specifically, these funds should be directed toward implementing initiatives within the three categories outlined in Section 107E1, A, B, and C of the Act. And while we do welcome applications for all three federally required focus areas, I want to emphasize that for this current application cycle, there will be a particular focus on CJA Priority A. So the CJA funding priorities will concentrate on these three key areas. Priority A focuses on investigative, administrative, and judicial handling of child abuse and neglect cases, ensuring reduced trauma for the victims and procedural fairness for the accused. The task force goal here is to transform the treatment of children and families entering the court system. This means implementing practices that reduce trauma, ensure cultural responsiveness, and provide trauma-informed services that generally support those affected. For Priority B, this is to support experimental programs for improving court proceedings in child abuse and neglect cases. The task force goal here is to encourage support efforts that not only enhance judicial handling, but also promote a multidisciplinary approach and utilize technology in addressing child abuse, neglect, and dependency cases. In Priority C, reform state laws to provide comprehensive protection for children involved in abuse or neglect cases. The task force goal here is support for legislation, policies, or protocols that define responsibilities and participation in the handling of these sensitive cases. Their vision is for a system that upholds the rights and dignity of every child and family involved. So a few additional CJA requirements. As you prepare your application for CJA funding, I'd like for you to keep in mind these important requirements. You may submit only one application for consideration. There's no match requirement for CJA grants, which can help streamline your funding request. And also, please be aware that funding is limited, so it's best that you keep your budget request reasonable, as excessive amounts may not be considered. And again, I'd like to emphasize that CJA projects are specifically designed to support system-level initiatives. So the GCC's Children's Justice Act Task Force is in the process of developing new performance measures that are set to be implemented on October 1st, 2025. These updated measures are being developed by work groups that include experts from the following disciplines: clinical services, child welfare, prosecution and law enforcement, and racial equity. By collaborating across these disciplines, we aim to create performance measures that truly reflect the needs of children and families in the justice system. And this effort will also be about ensuring that we can better support those we serve.
Okay, so I'm going to go over some other important information about applying for funding under the Juvenile Justice Planning Committee. It's important to note that our funding priorities appear differently inside of EBS than they did in GEMS for those of you who are previously funded programs. And I think that Kevin touched on this a little bit earlier. What you'll find is that in our RFA, and not just our RFAs, but in all of our RFAs, there's a funding priority crosswalk. We've created this as a guide to help applicants identify and apply for the correct funding priority. So hopefully it's helpful. But it looks a little like this. Though the Juvenile Justice Planning Team is one team, we will have separate RFAs for the Children's Justice Act and Title II funding. And so this is a little of what the funding priority crosswalk looks like inside of our request for applications. So we hope that it'll assist you with linking the proper priority to the program description that you're applying under inside of our system. Additionally, all of the requests for applications have a summary of key dates within them. And we just wanted to include this slide. It's going to be accessible to you online in the coming days. And it's also included again in our request for applications, which we intend to post by November 1st. So that seems to be it for us. If you have any questions about applying for Title II funding or Children's Justice Act funding, you can contact our team directly. We're pretty responsive, although we don't know what may happen. Please feel free to reach directly out to us, and we will answer and respond to any questions in the coming days, and they'll be posted online to our Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Donica and Tony. Very much appreciated.